Okay, let's go to then anti-human. Now, there's something interesting about the bias and sloppiness of the energy conversation, which is that it's very consistent. It's not that on some days the New York Times does a hit piece on coal, and then some days they do a hit piece on battery cars. It's not like some days you're going to notice an anti-solar piece and some days an anti-oil piece. You're always in the New York Times going to find an anti-oil piece or an anti-gas piece or an anti-nuclear piece, and you're almost never going to find a negative piece about solar and wind and batteries. Now, this is easy to take for granted because it's normal. But just as it is a mistake to take for granted that we disagree so much on our contexts are so different, that's ultimately because we have underlying frameworks that are different, but most people actually agree pretty much on underlying framework. They agree a lot, at least. It's wrong to take it as okay in any way that there's so much bias. And even if we say it's bad that there's bias, we need to understand why there's bias. So why is it that there's bias and sloppiness always at the expense of three forms of energy: fossil fuels, nuclear, and hydro? Because what they want you to think is that what's driving them is concern for climate, that they're so concerned about CO2 emissions from fossil fuels that they've just become completely rabidly against fossil fuels. But nuclear power and hydropower don't emit CO2, and they get a ton of opposition from many of the same green leaders and groups. So why is it that there's bias against these three technologies? Any thoughts? Here's what I think is going on with the bias and the sloppiness, what's driving it. There's one obvious commonality among hydroelectric power, nuclear power, and fossil fuel power. And I think people just don't notice it because they think it's impossible that this could be the common denominator people object to. And the common denominator is that they work. Like in the whole history of humanity, there are only three methods of producing energy that can produce abundant, affordable, reliable energy for even 100 million people. Like, think about that. In the whole history of humanity, there's only three core technologies: hydroelectric, nuclear, and hydrocarbon, or fossil fuel. There's only three. And those are, the world energy conversation is opposed to all three. Like, this should be very disturbing to us. We only have three, it'd be like, there are only three ways of curing disease. And everyone finds a reason to be opposed to all three. And they say, oh, we've got some green cure, it's coming in the future, don't worry. Just get rid of the three cures that work, and then we'll cure you later with our green cure at some point. But you say, look, that's not a serious thing, and why don't you make the green cure better than existing cures, and then we'll just use it voluntarily. So how is it possible that we object to the only things that work? And if you look at the arguments against them, and look past some of the superficiality, like nuclear is dangerous and stuff, there's one common thread to all the arguments against hydro, nuclear, and fossil fuels. And the common thread is they change nature too much. They change nature too much. So hydroelectric power. Why is hydroelectric power bad? Imagine you're having a conversation with James Cameron, who created Avatar, which is totally anti-fossil fuels. And right after making Avatar, he went down to Brazil to shut down a giant hydroelectric dam. But if you were really concerned about CO2, wouldn't the obvious thing to do to be to look for what are the non-carbon sources of energy that can replace any of fossil fuels significantly? So why are you against hydro? And then he says, well, it's interfering with nature. And I said, yeah, but you said the world is going to end if we don't reduce CO2 emissions, and this is a way to do it. Isn't it worth damming a river to save the world? And I say, no, we need free-flowing rivers. So what does that argument amount to? It amounts to, I prioritize unchanged nature over human life, right? I prioritize the free-flowing river over protection from CO2's harm to humans. Now, I'm not saying it does have harm, I'm just saying that's their argument. Or you look at nuclear power. Nuclear power is even more significant because nuclear power is the only form of non-carbon power that we know can scale to the whole world. So that theoretically, it's not the best idea for various reasons at this point, but theoretically, you could power a whole world with nuclear, like all the electricity at least. And yet the people who oppose fossil fuels are usually even more rabidly anti-nuclear. So you say, well, why is that? Why aren't you pro-nuclear? And they'll say, well, it's too dangerous. Like I love safety. I want to be safe. And I say, well, okay, I looked it up actually, and the way I tell if something is dangerous or safe is I look at how many people die per unit of energy produced. And it turns out nuclear power is the safest source of power ever created, mainly because it can't actually explode. So an explosion is a huge source of danger. And then they'll say, okay, sometimes if people are honestly concerned about safety, that'll affect them, but often that's not it. And they'll say, well, what about the waste? I'll say, okay, well, what about it? Like if we really want to, it's possible to recycle the waste, but we've been having the waste for decades and decades and decades, and our existing storage techniques have made us quite safe. You don't have people dying of nuclear waste. So I don't see a big problem. There are a lot more dangerous things in life than nuclear waste. Like a street is more dangerous than nuclear waste, right? That's how if I'm going to die, it's going to be from a street, probably. So, and then they'll say, well, what about the waste? They say, well, it lasts forever. Let's say, okay, but if it lasts 1 million years, if we can handle it safely for 1 million years, why do I care? And they'll say, well, no, it's just wrong. It's wrong for us to create something that lasts that long. It's not natural. I say, okay, well, so what are they, again? So they're saying that it's a higher priority for them to avoid creating unnatural material than to protect human beings with carbon-free energy, right? So again, they're prioritizing unchanged nature over human life. Now, what about fossil fuels? Well, notice that now the climate argument, you might think, well, it presents itself as a modestly pro-human argument. Like it says, there's this idea of, well, we're going to get drowned by the seas and burned by, the heat and whatnot, and we're going to have drought and all these things. But if you were really concerned about climate and human life, you wouldn't talk about it as like climate change is bad. Fossil fuels are causing climate change and that's bad, or climate change is bad, so we need to stop using fossil fuels. For a couple of reasons. One is if you're really pro-human, you don't regard climate change as a problem, you regard climate danger as a problem. Like, I think climate change is a very good aspiration for humans to have. We engage in indoor climate change all the time, and I was able to get a lot more work done last night because of indoor climate change in my hotel room. And outdoor climate change, we should aspire to be able to do things at the very least, like stop a Hurricane Harvey, let alone stave off another ice age if it came. So when people talk about climate change, they act like it's inherently bad to change climate. Like, thou shalt not change climate. It's like their key commandment. Whereas I just want to change climate in a way that's beneficial. So that's part of it. Why are they viewing it as they seem to think that it's just wrong to change nature, period, not because it's harmful to human life. And part of it is there's almost no interest in the harm that trying to stop climate change would do to human life. There's just no interest in what does it mean to, like people talk about, let's restrict 80% of fossil fuel use in the next 30 years. That's like 80% of people's energy, and well over a third of the world has very little energy. Like, that's a potentially very cruel policy, and nobody cares. Like, so their whole focus is just on, yeah, we're not too worried about people having enough energy. We just think it's wrong not to change climate. So again, it's unchanged nature comes above human life. Now, this is the most important part of the framework. It's more important than the bias and the sloppiness because it's what really leads to it. You can think of the bias and sloppiness as that's your decision-making process. That's your better way is comparative process. Like in any decision, you have a process of how do I compare things? Do I compare them biased, in a biased way or unbiased way, precise way or sloppy way? You have your comparative process. But the most important thing you have is what is the goal or the standard by which you judge a good decision? So if I'm judging the vaccination decision and my standard is the child's health, that's one thing. But if I say, no, the standard is not the child's health, the standard is I want to do the most natural thing possible, that could lead to a different outcome. You could do the natural thing, and it could be very harmful to the child. Human beings did the natural thing for tens of thousands of years, and it went very badly. Now, we didn't deliberately do it. Now, today, people have the idea that we should do the natural thing even when it's harmful. So what's going on in our whole energy conversation is that the standard of good and bad, the standard by which we're judging energy choices good or bad, the dominant standard that's being used is unchanged nature. And this is the most blatant of them, although people don't take it seriously. Like, if we think about I'll ask this, what is the ideal type of energy? What type of energy does our society, almost everyone agree, this would be the ideal type of energy if we could have it? What's the term? Like X energy, what form of energy is supposed to be the best? Renewable. Any other term?
Dispatchable.
No, well, dispatchable, I wish they thought that was good.
Clean.
What? Clean, okay, and there's one more term. Green, yeah, so green, clean, renewable. Now think about that. When we talk about like medical cures, we usually don't say, I want green medicine, right? I want the medicine that's been around for 10,000 years. Usually say I want the best medicine. And when if I was building a skyscraper, I'd probably say, I want the best materials, not the greenest materials, because if I make it out of wood, it might not do very well. Or if I say, I don't want a renewable phone, right? Because if I want a renewable phone, the only thing that would qualify is probably 2 cups and a string. So I want the best phone. So in other fields, we have this idea of we want the best for human life. But in energy, we have this idea of we want the greenest, the most renewable. Even clean is the wrong way of thinking about it. That's at most one attribute that you want. But that's not, the goal is not I want to be as clean as possible. I mean, in a sense, then you should just use no energy if the only goal was to be clean. The goal is you want the best energy. But in our society, we want green or renewable. Now, this is a literally toxic standard. Let's illustrate. So this is in our conversations, what's going on is people think that the standard by which we should judge energy, they don't think that, but it's under the surface that we want to change nature as little as possible. So let's imagine we apply this policy in life. If we wanted to change nature as little as possible, should we have turned a patch of dirt and trees in the northeast United States into New York City? Like if Greenpeace had the vote, yes New York or no New York, thumbs up or thumbs down?
They said no.
No. Okay, what about, maybe you don't like New York, what about having a child? If you want to minimize your impact, if you want to not change nature, should you self-replicate 1 or more times? That's the worst thing you could do, right? That's the most impact you can have on the future. That's often why people do it. Or it's part of the reason, like they think, oh, I want my family to be around. But if it's wrong to impact things, if we want to leave nature as unchanged as possible, the worst thing we can do is create more of us. The Sierra Club tells young women that if you're considering having a child, you need to know that your carbon legacy will increase by a factor of 6. That means your carbon footprint passed down. And what are we told today? That we should judge ourselves by how big our carbon footprint is. And it's bad to have a big carbon footprint, unless you're doing it to tell other people to have no carbon footprint, in the case of Gore and DiCaprio. But seriously, this is an anti-human idea of being green. And I'll take another one. This one is the most revealing, maybe. Have you ever seen the map at night of North Korea and South Korea? And it's like it's basically just Kim Jong-un's home is the only one with light in North, and then South is all light. Well, by the standard of unchanged nature, which is a more moral country, North Korea or South Korea? Yeah, they're doing a fantastic job, right? Because they're doing almost nothing. And that's the ideal. Now, this is such an important example because of the following. Which country has a better environment to live in? Where would you rather live in terms of clean air and clean water and sanitation? North Korea or South Korea? South Korea. Okay, so the green country has a dirty environment. The country that changes nature the least has one of the worst environments. And what this points to is that unchanged nature is a completely worthless standard and should not be used ever as a standard, because it's an anti-human standard. If you want a good environment, you should not say, let's not change nature. That doesn't give you a good environment. You get a good environment by changing nature intelligently. And the key to it is the right standard. So the wrong standard is unchanged nature. The right standard that I like to use is human flourishing. So human flourishing means human beings at their highest potential, mentally, physically, emotionally, longevity. And when you say human beings are flourishing, if I say, hey, humans are flourishing, does that imply a good environment or a filthy environment? It implies a good environment. But our environment, it's our environment. We see it as part of human flourishing. We don't see it as something above us that we shouldn't touch. So this is really the most important thing that's going on in the energy conversation, is your standard. How do you measure good and bad? Because if you measure good and bad by unchanged nature, which forms of energy are you going to support? So I think the most literally accurate answer is none. Now imagine that you believe in unchanged nature, which means you're against human productivity. That's probably a pretty hard thing to sell to people. Like, if you do my policy, you will die. That's basically what green amounts to in its pure form. So, or at least they'll say, if you do our policy, you'll have very little energy. Like, so there are 1.2 billion people today without electricity, and you can join their ranks if you join our green movement. That would be a hard sell, right? But on the other hand, how can you say that any form of energy is not changing nature, not having a big impact? Well, here's their solution. They support forms of energy that don't work. So the only form of energy the green movement has ever supported is imaginary energy. It's important, right? Because this is a historical fact. So the green movement, different forms of it at one point supported nuclear, then supported coal to oppose nuclear, then supported gas to oppose coal, then called gas fracking, right, and opposed it. So when gas wasn't a big player, like as soon as if they really liked gas, why weren't they so excited about this modern technology revolution that included this fracking technology that has been tested for decades? right? Because they weren't actually pro-energy. But if you're anti-energy, you can score points by pretending to be for forms of energy that don't work until they work. Like, does anyone think that if solar became fantastically successful and the whole world is getting coated with solar panels and all these giant transmission lines and all these giant dumps of solar waste material and all these giant mines, that anyone thinks Greenpeace is just going to have a party? No, they'll just find a way to oppose it. I mean, let's put it this way. If oil got outcompeted by solar and oil became the thing of the past, Greenpeace would be pro-oil. They'd just say, look, we got to use the organic form of energy, right? It's a natural fuel. It's biodegradable. It saved the whales. Like, it enriches our atmosphere with CO2, right? Human beings love warming, right? Nobody wants it to be that much colder, but a lot of people want it to be warmer. It'll help us prevent an ice age. Right? They'd come up with these whole set of reasons. So green energy means no energy. And as a standard, therefore, what it functions and what it does is it is just a weapon for anything you oppose. Green is a weapon for anything you oppose, and it's a temporary profiteering mechanism until the green's anything that isn't very good that you want to sell. So you just add a green to something, green X, and then you can add a big markup. But because it's an anti-human standard, it cannot be practiced consistently, and therefore its function as a weapon against the successful technologies. So imagine what would happen if, as a society, we let this toxic standard into our minds and into our schools and into our media and into our conversations, and if the oil industry actually used it too and said, yeah, we're trying to be greener and we want to be green and we're not going to have environmental impact. Well, that's the world we have. Right? That is the world we have. Everybody has agreed on the toxic standard, and everybody is allowing the Greens to pretend, A, that they care about our environment, B, that they're for energy, and C, that they care about humans. And none of those three things are true, insofar as you take that as a consistent standard. So this is totally infiltrated everything. So it's the heart of the Hydra. Ultimately, what's going on with the bias and sloppiness is that if you're green, you're not pro-energy. But if you're green, you don't care about you don't really care about the human impacts of things. So if you talk about, say, pollution in China, you don't really care about the Chinese people. You're just looking for a reason to oppose industry. So if you say to the person, hey, green leader, but what about all of the improvements in life expectancy in China? Or why aren't you in favor of them just using modern filtration technology like we have? And you say, well, why are you so biased, right? Why are you so biased and you're just ignoring all the benefits and you're exaggerating the costs? Well, ultimately what's happening is they're not using the same standard of cost. Their whole thing is, their standard is changing nature is bad, so all they really object to is the fact that China is industrializing. So they're being dishonest and they're acting like, oh, you should care about this too because you care about humans, but they're not trying to look at it in an honest way. They're not looking at it from a human perspective. They just use human reasons to get followers. Now the good news is that in a conversation and in other communication, you can reframe it because people don't really believe this. Some do, but very rarely do people really believe that, for example, if you had, if a polar bear was attacking a child or if two polar bears were trying to attack a child, that if you totally believe in green, you got to say, well, you got to let that happen, right? No, because you got to, right? You can't have that much impact. Those polar bears, and there are fewer of them than there are of us. But most people actually value human life. They value their own life. They value the lives of other humans. So most people, if you give them the choice, will say that, no, I want what's best for human life. I want a good environment because I care about human life. I don't want a human-free environment. So if we take the Paris Accords example, if I'll just say to somebody after asking about the bias and sloppiness, I'll just say, would you agree that the ultimate goal, the best policy toward Paris is the one that's best for human flourishing and human progress? Would you agree that we want that? And in my experience, 90% of people will say yes, and 10% of people will say no. And then if they say no, then you have to push and say, like, you really mean that you don't care about humans? And because sometimes they'll say, oh, well, you need to be long range. And I say, sure, yeah, but long range about human beings. And you need to think about the whole ecosystem, sure, but sometimes species interests conflict, and so we have to decide when we conflict with the malarial mosquito, whose side do we take? And so I take are you in the team mosquito or team human? Right? So you kind of push, but you got to give them this rich sense of human flourishing, but most people agree with that. And that's profound because most people are not measuring, are not judging their energy choices by a clear standard. It's like as if everyone was making the medical decisions by what's the most natural instead of what's the most healthy. But if you ask most people, they will want to do the thing that's best for human beings. But again, it used to be invisible, and you need to make it visible. So those are the three things that need to happen in the conversation. You can blend together bias and sloppiness if you want. But the three things that need to happen are you need to get them to agree to be as even-handed as possible, to be as precise as possible, and to be pro-human. And if you can get that agreement, it magically changes a lot about the conversation. And not only the conversation, but if you have that in your own mind consistently, it will change a lot about the way that you think.